it's at this point here that we're going to talk about the beginnings of one of the world's strongest powers. And England's going to become one of those nations that we talk about a lot going over the next several generations. And so here's where it begins. Keep in mind that England, for quite a bit of time now, has been under the reign of feudalism, just like many of the other European countries. And so, as a result of feudalism, they have a number of very important and wealthy nobles or feudal lords that have control over the area of England. They have one in particular who has kind of come to the forefront. His name was Edward the Confessor, and he had become the king of the Anglo-Saxons. He had become the king of all of these other feudal lands, and everybody had looked to him as the leader of all of the manors and all of the kingdoms that existed there in England. Well, Edward the Confessor, he died, but he did not have a direct heir to his throne and a direct person who was going to take over for him. And so that launched a huge disagreement over who should be in charge of England and all this territory and all these other feudal lands that had been owned by Edward the Confessor. So William, the Duke of Normandy, was a distant cousin, and he decided he was going to claim the throne. Well, Normandy was actually across the English Channel over in what we would consider today to be France. However, at that time, it was still to some extent part of what we would consider early England. And so he decided that he was going to come across the English Channel. He was going to claim this territory on behalf of his cousin. Well, that did not go over well with the nobility. Many of the people who had known Edward the Confessor did not believe that he would have wanted this Duke of Normandy to come in without knowing the people, without knowing the land. And so they decided, no, we don't want this guy. We want Harold. Harold's our man. And so they refused William, and they decided they were going to elect Harold, the king, the Earl of Wessex, to become their new king. Well, of course, William was not going to just walk away. This was a huge opportunity for him. And so William and Harold decided that they were going to do battle. So this gets to the major conflict between William and Harold. They're going to go to battle, and they're going to fight it out. And during this battle, here we go, Harold is killed in this battle. And when Harold is killed in the battle, then that means that now William has control over all of this territory. He has won by warfare. This is the way that people maintain power. And you could say, well, what if the people didn't want William, just like they didn't want him before Harold died? Well, that was a real possibility. And all they would have had to do was mount an army large enough that could defeat William. But unfortunately, Harold had used whatever armies were available, and so there were no armies left in order to defeat William. So therefore, they all had to bow to his new reign. So now William becomes the new king. He is labeled as William the Conqueror. And he becomes the feudal lord over all of England as an outsider. And he had more land outside of England, but he really embraced the new English lifestyle, and he embraced the people of England. And so he decided that one of the best ways for him to determine his new territory and his new land was to take a census of the people and of all his land and all his resources. And this becomes known as the Domesday Book, or sometimes pronounced Doomsday Book, and that is the official census of William's land and resources. And so here comes William trying to find out exactly what he owns and all the extent of the wealth that he has accumulated. And this Doomsday Book becomes a very important resource to understanding English history. He also decides to make things better with the English nobility by inviting a number of them to become part of his private council. It's called the Curia Regis, or the Great Council, where he takes many of the chief vassals or many of the important nobility that had at one time opposed him, And he invited them in and said, listen, guys, I don't want to be your enemy. I want to be a helper to you. Please advise me. Help me understand how the people of England live and how I can best help them. And this helped turn his reign around, where uh, the people began to respect him a whole lot more than they had once thought he was going to rule. Now, we are not going to be able to talk about every single ruler in England. We are going to hit the highlights of a few of them. So I picked out a few of these guys that are really important to know and have key things that they did to advance England into a modern European power and pull them out of feudalism. And so as we move down the line here, we're going to take a look at Henry II. Now, William's family line died out after 2 generations. He did not have a direct line to the throne uh, after his initial family died out. And so uh, William had a great grandson. His name was Henry II. And unfortunately for Henry, he was French. Well, the French and the English have always struggled to get along, and after Henry decides that he's going to take the throne for his great grandfather, it's not going to get a whole lot better. And so his land was primarily in France, and he owned more territory outside of France than he did inside of England. And now all of a sudden he becomes the king over all the people in England. This is not going to go over well, and so it provokes a major rivalry between England and France, to which that rivalry still continues even to this day. And very few times have the French and the English sided together in order to accomplish a similar goal. In more recent history, they have joined on the same sides in the world wars, but prior to that, many, many times, the French and the English just do not get along. And it kind of goes back here to this whole who's in control situation. Well, this rivalry helped to establish a common law because even though they did not like the fact that Henry was their new king, they had no other choice. They had no army to be able to defeat Henry or to rise up against him, but they did negotiate this common law, which Henry was forced to sign. And so it was one set of royal laws that applied to everybody inside of the kingdom. And this was a unique feature. And for us in our modern world, we think, well, of course, everybody's going to have the same law that live in the same country. But that was not the case under feudalism. It depended on the region in which you lived, or depended on the manner on which you lived, and what your feudal lord had set as the established law. When Henry comes in, he decides that everybody needs to be under the same law, and the people help him decide this as well. And that way, Henry he doesn't rule his people ineffectively or unfairly, because everybody is subject to the same laws. Now, it must be clear that the king did not have to abide by these laws. It was only the common people that lived underneath the king. And we're going to talk about that change later on in history and how that's going to provoke wars. Now, you may have heard of this king in the past, Richard I, nicknamed the Lionheart. Well, Richard was probably best known for not ruling England. And he left during the King's Crusade, and he wanted to make sure that he was represented and England was represented in this crusade as they went off to battle against the Muslims over in Jerusalem. And so when he left, he decided that he was going to leave his brother in charge. His brother's name was John, and he conspired with the King of France to try to remove Richard from power so that John can take over. Now, in case you haven't picked up on it yet, this is the legend of Robin Hood, and some of the stories and the folk tales that come out of Robin Hood come from this era of history. But they tried to get rid of Richard. Richard was a noble king, although he did have some of his own downfalls and really didn't rule, but he was well liked by the people. And King John was not so much. And so therefore, when he tried to remove him from power, that did not go over well with those who were living in England at that time, nor did it go over well with Richard. After Richard dies, King John does take over the throne, and he is a very poor leader, and the people do not respect him, and he very much upsets his own people. He upsets the Pope, which you never want to do that, and he also makes enemies with France. And so, therefore, he really does not have a whole lot of friends and does not do a whole lot for England. So, the people threaten to revolt, and they threaten to remove him out of power, and even worse, threaten to kill him. And so they negotiate the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is perhaps one of the most significant documents ever signed in history. If you're in Washington, D.C., there is a copy of the original Magna Carta in Washington, D.C., in the National Archives. Go take a look. So the Magna Carta does a couple of things here. Number one, it limits the king's power. And you need to make sure that you write that down, because this is the first time in European history that we have seen a king willingly sign a document that says that his power can be limited by the people. That is totally a new thought, a new idea. The second thing that it does is that it says the king is not above the law. The king has to follow the same laws that are part of the common law. So he can't violate his own laws that he's expecting his own people to live under. And in our world, we think, of course, that's the way it should be, but not in their world. And this is where we get these ideas from in our country, goes back here to the Magna Carta. And thirdly, the Magna Carta said that the king can be removed for a violation of the law. So they had the power. The people now are given power for the very first time in European history. The people are given power over their government in a very small way, but a way to keep the king accountable and to keep the king honorable in the way that he leads them. Well, our last main king that we need to talk about today is Edward I. He is perhaps one of the most gifted of all of the kings in Europe during the Middle Ages. He united the people of England together. That was no small task, especially after the debacle of King John and the issuance of the Magna Carta. And while the people gained power, it still didn't make the people unified altogether. But Edward was able to do this. And one of the most significant things about Edward's reign is that he creates Parliament. And Parliament has this meaning of to speak or to discuss, because King Edward wanted to hear from the people, and he wanted the people to have a voice to help him rule and to help him lead. And so the Parliament here was an expansion of the Great Council. Remember, we talked about that with William the Conqueror. It was an expansion of the Great Council of advisors that William had brought in. Now Edward wanted to expand that and wanted to make it bigger, so that way others could bring their ideas here into the government and help the king rule the people. There are two houses that are created in Parliament. There is, first of all, the House of Commons. This is the representatives of the base community. These would be the more common people, the lower class, primarily made up of knights and citizens that would represent in the House of Commons. And then you have the House of Lords. And this would be the upper class. This would be the nobility. The feudal lords and the vassals would be a part of the House of Lords. And they would elect representatives to come and report to the king and advise the king. And this is the way that England is going to operate over the next several centuries until they establish a constitution and more of the power is taken from the king and given to the people.